What would you do if a stranger, with nothing but hope in their eyes, asked you for $1? On a day like any other in the city, where people rushed past without a second glance, one man sat on the pavement, unnoticed and unheard. His hand trembled slightly as he reached out, his voice lost in the noise around him. Most walked by without a second glance, until Barron Trump stopped. What followed wasn't just a moment, it was a story that would leave everyone who witnessed it questioning their own perspectives on kindness. He was no stranger to this spot. Day after day, he positioned himself near the edge of the street, his tattered clothes and worn shoes bearing silent testimony to struggles that no one bothered to ask about. A small sign rested against his knees, "Need help. Anything appreciated." His face, weathered by time and hardship, carried an expression that was neither angry nor defeated, just tired. With a trembling hand, he reached out to the stream of passers-by. "Can you spare just $1?" he asked, his voice soft but steady. The question, repeated countless times throughout the day, was met with averted gazes, hurried footsteps, and polite but empty apologies. That was when he noticed a boy, tall and composed, walking along the sidewalk. The boy's posture was upright but relaxed, his expression calm. He didn't look like the others, he wasn't in a rush, nor was he preoccupied with a phone or briefcase. He stood out not because of any grand gesture, but because he seemed to notice things others didn't. The man hesitated for a moment. Something about the boy felt different. Gathering his courage, he repeated his plea, his words carrying the weight of someone who had asked for help 1,000 times before and expected nothing in return. "Can you spare just $1?" The boy paused. It was a small pause, but it carried meaning. His eyes met the man's, and for a brief moment, the noise of the street seemed to soften. The boy's gaze wasn't one of pity or judgment, it was thoughtful, as though he truly heard the question, not just the words. The boy, as it turned out, was Barron Trump. Known more by his last name than his individual self, he was often accompanied by assumptions about privilege and detachment. But here, in this moment, he stood not as the son of a powerful figure but as a teenager confronted with the kind of human vulnerability that transcends status or wealth. Barron reached into his pocket. The movement was unremarkable to anyone who might have been watching, but to the man on the ground, it was everything. Barron didn't speak right away. Instead, he unfolded a bill and handed it to the man, not $1, but enough to buy a hot meal, maybe more. His actions were deliberate, quiet. It wasn't the money that mattered most, but the way he knelt slightly, meeting the man's eyes as he said, "I hope this helps." The man stared at the bill, his hands shaking. It wasn't just the amount, it was the act itself. For someone accustomed to being ignored, the gesture carried a weight that far exceeded its monetary value. Around them, a few people slowed their pace, taking notice. Some paused, as though trying to understand what they had just witnessed. Barron didn't linger. He stood, adjusted his coat, and walked away, leaving behind a moment that would ripple far beyond the street corner. The man sat there for a long time, staring at the bill, his thoughts a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. For him, this wasn't just about the money, it was about being seen, about the quiet acknowledgement of his humanity. Moments like these often go unnoticed in the rush of daily life. But for those who witnessed it, the encounter served as a reminder, sometimes, the smallest gestures carry the greatest impact. It wasn't about grand displays or headlines, it was about the simple act of choosing to stop, to listen, to care. Thank you for watching this story unfold. If this moment moved you, please like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We'd love to hear your thoughts and where you're watching from. Your support allows us to continue sharing stories that reflect the best in humanity. For weeks, the man had made this corner of the street his temporary haven. Each day, he would settle there, his tattered belongings carefully arranged around him. A small cardboard sign leaned against his knees, its letters fading but still legible, "Need help. Anything appreciated." His withered hands rested in his lap, and though his eyes occasionally met those of passers-by, most avoided his gaze entirely. It was another long, cold day, and the man had grown accustomed to the rhythm of rejection. Some people walked past quickly, pretending not to notice. Others offered an apologetic shake of the head, accompanied by the familiar refrain, "Sorry, not today." But the man didn't complain. He simply sat, his hope dwindling but not entirely gone. On this particular afternoon, he repeated the same quiet request to anyone who walked near. "Can you spare just $1?" The words carried a mix of weariness and resolve, spoken without expectation but with the faintest sliver of hope. That's when something unusual happened. A sleek black car pulled up to the curb nearby, its engine humming softly before it fell silent. The door opened, and a tall, composed teenager stepped out. His presence was calm yet unmistakable. It was Barron Trump. Barron wasn't the type to draw unnecessary attention to himself, yet there was something about him that made people pause. Perhaps it was the quiet confidence in his movements or the thoughtful way he surveyed his surroundings. As he stepped onto the sidewalk, his security detail lingered discreetly at a distance, allowing him a rare moment of independence. The man noticed him immediately. Barron's sharp coat and polished shoes were a stark contrast to his own worn and frayed appearance. Still, something in the boy's demeanor made him feel as though he could ask the question he had posed countless times before. "Can you spare just $1?" the man said, his voice steady but soft. Barron stopped. He turned toward the man, his gaze steady. For a moment, the busy street seemed to quiet, as though the noise of the world had faded into the background. He didn't rush to respond. Instead, he studied the man's face with a thoughtful expression, taking in the quiet desperation behind the words. Reaching into his pocket, Barron pulled out a folded bill. He stepped closer, kneeling slightly so he was at the man's level. Without a word, he placed the bill into the man's hand, ensuring it wouldn't slip from his grasp. "This is for more than just today," Barron said, his voice low but clear. "Take it and do something good for yourself." The man's hands trembled as he unfolded the bill. His eyes widened as he realized it was far more than the single dollar he had asked for. His voice cracked as he whispered, thank you so much." Barron gave a small nod, a faint but genuine smile crossing his face. He didn't wait for acknowledgement or praise. He stood, adjusted his coat, and walked away, leaving the man with a gift that was more than just monetary. It was a reminder that he wasn't invisible. Around them, a few people who had witnessed the interaction paused, their own thoughts seemingly interrupted by what they had just seen. A mother holding her child's hand glanced back at the man, her expression thoughtful. A street vendor stopped mid-sale, watching quietly. For those few moments, the street seemed to share in the man's quiet gratitude. As Barron disappeared into the flow of the city, the man looked down at the bill in his hand, then back up at the street around him. For the first time in a long while, his shoulders lifted slightly, his hope renewed by a stranger who had taken the time to see him. The man shifted slightly, his thin frame hunched against the cold air, as Barron Trump walked closer. There was a moment of hesitation, a brief flicker of doubt in the man's eyes as he decided whether to speak. Finally, in a voice that trembled with both exhaustion and a flicker of hope, he asked, "Can you spare $1?" The words hung in the air, fragile but unmistakable. It wasn't just a request for money, it was a plea for acknowledgement, for someone to see him, to recognize that he still existed in a world that so often passed him by. His hand remained outstretched, and for a moment, time seemed to slow. Barron paused mid-step, his body slightly turning toward the man. His hand instinctively adjusted the edge of his coat, a small gesture that betrayed a moment of thoughtfulness. Around them, the bustle of the city continued, but the noise seemed to fade for those who noticed the interaction. The tension was quiet but undeniable. A woman walking her dog slowed her pace, glancing over her shoulder. A delivery driver paused by his parked bicycle, curiosity flickering across his face. The homeless man's words had reached Barron, but his reaction remained unreadable. For a moment, Barron just stood there, looking at the man, the voiceover explains, steady and reflective. Some wondered if he had heard him. Others thought he might walk away. But what he did next left everyone watching in silence. Barron stepped closer, his movements deliberate yet calm. He lowered his gaze to meet the man's eyes, his expression softening. It wasn't pity, it was understanding, a recognition of the vulnerability in front of him. Without breaking eye contact, Barron reached into his pocket and pulled out a folded bill. The homeless man's eyes widened as Barron handed it to him, the gesture slow and intentional. The man's hand trembled as he took the bill, unfolding it to reveal far more than he had asked for. His lips parted as if to speak, but no words came out at first. Finally, his voice cracked with emotion. "Thank you," he whispered, barely loud enough to be heard. Barron offered a small nod, his face calm but purposeful. He didn't linger or wait for a reaction from the small crowd that had begun to gather. Instead, he adjusted his jacket once more and continued walking, blending back into the rhythm of the street. The man, still seated on the ground, stared down at the bill in his hand, his expression a mix of disbelief and gratitude. A few people nearby exchanged glances, their faces reflecting quiet admiration or even shame for having walked past without stopping. The voiceover continues, carrying the moment forward. It wasn't just the money that mattered, it was the act itself. For a man who had grown accustomed to being invisible, this moment was a reminder that kindness can come when it's least expected. As Barron walked further down the sidewalk, life slowly returned to its usual pace. The street resumed its noise and motion, but for those who had witnessed the encounter, the moment lingered in their minds. What had started as a simple question, a request for just $1, had become something far more meaningful. The homeless man looked up, his gaze following Barron for a moment before falling back to the bill in his hand. He folded it carefully, holding it close as if it were more than just money. For him, it was a small but powerful reminder that he hadn't been forgotten. The homeless man sat there for a moment longer, the folded bill still clutched tightly in his hands. He looked around, as if trying to process what had just happened. A few onlookers had paused, their curiosity turning into quiet reflection as they resumed their day. But for the man, the world felt different now. The weight of that small moment lingered, pressing on him in a way he couldn't quite describe. He tucked the bill into the inner pocket of his coat, patting it gently, almost protectively. It wasn't just money, it was the spark of something he hadn't felt in years. He whispered to himself, as if trying to solidify the moment in his memory, someone still cares. Nearby, the woman who had slowed her pace to observe turned back for a brief moment, watching the man as he carefully gathered his belongings. Her expression softened, and she reached into her own bag, pulling out a few items, a sandwich she had packed earlier, a bottle of water, and walked over. The man looked up as she approached, her footsteps cautious but purposeful. She extended the items with a small smile. "Here," she said, her voice quiet but kind. "I thought you might need these." He stared at her, his words caught in his throat. Finally, he nodded, accepting the food with both hands. "Thank you," he said softly, his voice still shaky. She didn't linger, offering a warm smile before walking away, her pace now lighter than before. As the man sat there, his hands trembling slightly as he opened the sandwich wrapper, another person approached, a middle-aged man in a suit, clearly on his lunch break. Without a word, the man in the suit placed a $20 bill into the cup next to him and walked away. The small crowd that had initially gathered had dispersed, but the ripple effect of Barron's simple act was still unfolding. The man looked down at the sandwich in one hand, the bill in his pocket, and the growing collection in his cup. For the first time in a long while, he felt more than just gratitude, he felt a glimmer of hope. Later that evening, as the city's pace slowed and the streets grew quieter, the man found himself walking toward a shelter he had avoided in the past. The folded bill Barron had given him was still tucked safely in his coat, and the thought of those few simple words, "You deserve that chance," echoed in his mind. He stepped through the shelter's doors, his heart heavy with uncertainty but his steps lighter than they had been in years. The man sat quietly on a bench in the corner of a nearby park later that evening. The sandwich he'd been given was now just a wrapper in his pocket, but the folded bill Barron had handed him was still safely tucked away inside his coat. He pulled it out, unfolding it carefully once more, as if to confirm it was real. For years, he'd lived day to day, scraping by with little hope for change. Now, this single moment of generosity felt like more than just a gift, it felt like a reason to believe in something better. He made his way to a small convenience store, clutching the bill tightly. Inside, he picked up a few necessities, a loaf of bread, a bottle of water, and a pair of socks. As he approached the counter, the cashier gave him a curious look, but the man didn't notice. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't just buying what he could, he was thinking about what he needed. From there, he walked toward a nearby shelter he'd passed many times, but had always been hesitant to enter. The place had a reputation for being overcrowded, and he'd often been too discouraged to try. But tonight was different. He stepped inside, greeted by the warmth of the room and the smell of soup cooking in the back. A volunteer approached him, smiling kindly. "Welcome," she said. "Do you need a place to stay tonight?" The man nodded, his throat tightening. "Yes, I do," he replied softly. That night, as he lay on a cot surrounded by others seeking refuge, he thought about Barron's words, "This isn't just for today. Use it to take a step forward." They weren't just kind words, they were a call to action. And now, for the first time in years, he felt like he could take that step. Meanwhile, the small act of kindness had already started to ripple outward. The woman who had given him the sandwich earlier shared the story with her friends, inspiring them to gather extra coats and blankets for others in need. The man in the suit who had added to the cup went home that evening and donated to a local outreach program, mentioning the interaction that had moved him. Back on the street corner where it had all begun, others noticed the man's absence the next day. A food truck vendor who often parked nearby asked a regular customer, "Did you see what happened yesterday? I've been thinking about it all night. That kid really changed something." The customer nodded, replying, "It's not every day you see someone so young make such a big difference without trying to show off." By the following week, the man had connected with a caseworker at the shelter, who helped him apply for temporary housing. The folded bill that had seemed like just another donation had become much more, a catalyst for change. He began attending a job skills workshop at the same shelter, determined to rebuild the pieces of his life that had felt irreparable. For those who had witnessed the moment between Barron and the man, the story lived on, passed along in quiet conversations and social media posts. It wasn't just the act of giving that inspired them, it was the simplicity and sincerity of it. It reminded them that even the smallest gestures could make a profound difference, not just for the recipient but for everyone involved. And for the man, it was proof that he wasn't invisible, that even in the hardest of times, there were still people willing to extend a hand. It wasn't the end of his struggles, but it was a start, a powerful, unexpected start. The man walked slowly along the sidewalk, his steps steadier than they had been in weeks. His pockets no longer felt empty, not just because of the money he had received, but because of what it represented, a moment when someone had chosen to see him as more than a shadow in the crowd. Each step forward seemed to carry a sense of possibility, a stark contrast to the heaviness he had felt for so long. As he passed familiar faces on the street, he noticed things he hadn't before, the way a shopkeeper smiled at a child carrying a balloon, the way a street performer danced with enthusiasm despite the sparse crowd. The world around him felt different, not because it had changed, but because his perspective had. Barron's simple act had reminded him that people were capable of goodness, even in a world that often felt indifferent. For Barron, the gesture was likely one of many moments in his day, but for the man, it had become a spark that reignited his sense of self. He thought back to Barron's words, simple yet profound, "This isn't just for today. Use it to take a step forward." In that brief exchange, Barron had shown something that many overlook, that compassion doesn't depend on wealth, fame, or age. It comes from the willingness to pause, to recognize another person's humanity, and to extend a hand without expecting anything in return. It wasn't the amount of money that mattered most, it was the acknowledgement, the reminder that he wasn't invisible. As the man continued walking, his mind wandered to the faces of those who had stopped to watch that day. He wondered if they, too, had been touched by what they saw. Were they thinking differently about the people they passed each day? Would they go home and reflect on what they could do to help someone else? In a way, Barron's kindness had created ripples far beyond the moment itself. It had sparked conversations, inspired others to act, and, most importantly, reminded everyone that small gestures could carry great meaning. The man paused at the edge of the street, looking down at the crosswalk ahead. The cars rushed by, their headlights cutting through the dimming evening light. He adjusted his coat, feeling the small weight of the bill still tucked safely inside. It wasn't about the money anymore, it was about the confidence it had given him, the belief that perhaps his story wasn't over. The themes of connection and compassion resonated deeply with those who heard his story. It wasn't just about Barron Trump or the man he helped, it was about all of us. How often do we rush past someone in need, too consumed by our own lives to notice? How often do we forget the power of a kind word, a small gesture, or even just a moment of acknowledgement? The story leaves us with a question: what would you do if you were in Barron's shoes? Would you stop? Would you help? Sometimes, it only takes a moment to make a difference, a moment that could change a life forever. The man took a deep breath, stepping into the crosswalk with renewed purpose. His journey forward was uncertain, but it was no longer weighed down by despair. For him, it wasn't just a gift of money, it was a gift of hope. The story of this small yet profound encounter reminds us of a simple truth: acts of kindness, no matter how small, hold the potential to ripple far beyond their original moment. It wasn't just about Barron handing over a folded bill or the homeless man receiving it. It was about what followed: the spark of hope, the reminder of humanity, and the realization that connection still exists in a world that often feels disconnected. Across the city, others who had witnessed or heard about the event began to reflect. Some chose to act. A man walking home that evening stopped at the same corner where the homeless man had been and offered his own small gesture, a warm coffee, to another person sitting nearby. A young woman who had watched the moment play out returned home and cleaned out her closet, packing warm clothes to donate to the local shelter. The kindness that started with one teenager had begun to inspire others, reminding them that everyone has the power to make someone else's day just a little brighter. These acts didn't change the world in grand or dramatic ways, but for the people involved, they were life-changing. They created ripples that continue to grow, unseen but deeply felt. As the screen shifts to show a montage of people extending their hands in different ways, donating food, sharing warm blankets, sitting down to listen to someone's story, the message becomes clear. This isn't just Barron's story, nor is it just the homeless man's. It's about all of us and the choices we make every day. This story reminds us that we all have the power to make a difference, no matter how small it may seem. Sometimes, it's a word of encouragement, a few moments of your time, or a small gift that can spark hope in someone else's life. Now, it's your turn. What would you do if someone asked you for help? Would you stop and listen, or would you walk away? Share your thoughts in the comments below. We'd love to hear your perspective. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to continue sharing moments that inspire and remind us all of the strength and compassion and the beauty of connection.